Hi there, Dr. Davis. Good to be with you today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you and your people.
Yeah. Hey, I thought I would just start with a pretty personal question. You have been doing biblical scholarship for a long time. You've had a full and productive career in that field. And I'm curious, you've also preached frequently, um, and you love to preach from the Old Testament and study the Old Testament. What is it in your own heart over all of these years that's kept you coming back to that specific part of the Christian scriptures?
Um, Thank you for that question. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is it's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's I was speaking to a Jewish friend last week. We were doing some studying together, and he said it's like a sea,
Uh,
and the further in you go, the deeper it gets.
mm,
And so it's um, it's just a wonderful place to swim, and it connects in a sense to everything. It's such a deeply human um, it's such a deeply human testimony, or whole collection of testimonies to God's ways with us and our life in the presence of God. And so if you're interested in being human, um, this is certainly a place to spend a lot of time. It's also written in Hebrew, which is simply a beautiful language. So,
yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. And to your point that it's a testimony about being human. It's something that if you're as you said, interested in being human, um, this is the book for you. Ruth is a kind of exceptional example of that, isn't it? As a piece of literature, there's something very, and I mentioned this in my sermon last week. There's something very ordinary about this book, at least compared to certain other narratives. Um, and yet, as much as it seems familiar to us, as much as it's a family moving here and there, looking for work, looking to improve their life, and falling in love and into friendship, but at the same time, it's quite different from us. So I think, for example, of the way that in Ruth 2 we heard that Ruth's citizenship status got brought up several times. The narrator calls her Ruth the Moabite. Boaz's supervisor of the work in his field calls her a Moabite worker girl, and Ruth even describes herself as nothing but a foreigner. And so I think that clues me into the fact that we're in a different kind of world, because most of us wouldn't even know where to point to find Moab on a map. Um, but there's also, it seems like, some cultural differences and similarities. Could you kind of talk about why you think it's so important for us as readers to hear that Moabite that Ruth is from Moabite is different from these people that she's now with in Bethlehem?
sure. First of all, if if you don't know, Moab is what we now call Jordan.
Mhm.
Okay, it's sort of central Jordan. Um, I'm going to start at the sort of 35,000 foot level, and then I'm going to come down to Bethlehem. Israel was in an awkward situation in the ancient world, just as Israel is in an awkward situation in the modern world. Um, it was surrounded by neighbors, some of those neighbors very powerful, more powerful than Israel. Often those neighbors were hostile.
Yeah.
Um, Israel was also religiously unique in its environment, um, as a people who worshiped a single God rather than multiple gods. Um, and the result is that Israel is a relatively insular culture. Its borders were porous, so we can assume that there were people crossing them all the time,
Sure.
sometimes with hostile intent or armies marching through, because of its very crucial um, physical location between the two great empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But Israel's ideology, you might say, is relatively self-contained. One indication of that is that Israel strongly favors marrying in,
Sure.
endogamy, as anthropologists call it. And Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, has prohibitions against marrying Moabites in particular.
Right.
They are, you might say, a genealogical dead end. So remember, and this is a spoiler alert, remember the end of this story is a marriage between an Israelite, a Bethlehemite, Boaz, and Ruth the Moabite, a marriage and a baby.
Right.
And that baby is not just any old Bethlehemite, it's the grandfather of King David. So this story is a very important and consequential exception to that norm of endogamy. I assume that this story is told and retained because it was actually true. Because it was known that in David's background was this, you might say, woman without a country.
Right.
And yet it's Ruth the Moabite who opens up the future for this little backwater people.
Right.
We tend to think Israel was the biggest thing going in the ancient Near East. It was not. It was a pin dot on the maps of empire. And so this story of a foreigner, a low status foreigner,
Right.
a migrant worker, a woman, you can't get any lower status than that in the ancient world. This story acquires ethical significance. Ethical significance, certainly in its ancient context. I think that's why it's in the Bible, and maybe even in our own.
Yeah.
Because Ruth turns out to be a moral example for Israelites and even for God. Naomi says to Ruth, "May God show you good faith." The Hebrew word is chesed. May God show you good faith as you have shown good faith. She's speaking to both her daughters-in-law, to your dead husbands and to me.
Yeah. That's a powerful thing to think about, that she's comparing what God ought to do to what Ruth has done. Yeah.
Exactly. So Naomi is recognizing that Ruth, who is herself a widow, who has no man, no either husband or no grown children, in a culture in which women who were alone didn't own land, they didn't have any standing in the community. Ruth is vulnerable, and yet Naomi is acknowledging that she has the strength and the courage to show good faith to Naomi, even to the extent of leaving her home place to go someplace she's never been.
You brought up the word Hesed to describe their relationship. Could you tell us a little bit more about that word? It's critical to this book, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a word, Hesed. It's almost untranslatable. So I'm going to try to explain it to you, and then we can talk about translation. It occurs probably hundreds of times in the Bible. Okay. Even people who don't know Hebrew but have studied Old Testament tend to know the word chesed. It's often considered to be a distinctly Israelite virtue. It's the kind of covenant glue that connects Israel to one Israelite to other Israelites and that whole community to God.
So would you, sorry to interrupt, when you say it's a particularly kind of Israelite virtue, for example, it would be surprising then for the
Exactly.
Israelites in Bethlehem that Ruth is an exemplar of this particular virtue.
Exactly. And it would be surprising for any Israelite hearer of this story, because it's important to remember that in the ancient world, most people didn't read this story, they heard it.
Right.
It's a bit of a shock to realize that the most, I think it's true, that the most outstanding exemplar of Hesed in the Bible is Ruth the Moabite.
Oh, wow.
And the ancient rabbis pick that up. They say Ruth teaches us what is the reward of practicing this virtue.
Mm.
So what does it mean? It's often translated, or traditionally, steadfast love, loving kindness, more recently, mercy, kindness. I translated it good faith or acts of good faith.
Okay.
Because Chesed, it certainly shows itself on the ground.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it's not a virtue that stays inside. It's relational. It's an active, a very active sort of thing.
Exactly. It's fundamentally relational. As I say, it's the glue that holds people together in covenant relationship, and both people show chesed toward God, and God shows chesed toward people.
Okay.
It's a reciprocal relationship. And it's doing, you might say it's doing what genuine relationship requires.
Okay.
And that isn't always what somebody asks for.
Mm-hmm.
So it involves a measure of discernment to see, what does this person really need?
Right.
And Ruth shows that toward Naomi when Naomi tells her to go back.
Right.
And wants her to go back, it seems. And Ruth, there's this great line that says, Ruth says, don't press me to leave you.
Right.
It's not going to happen. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And there's this great line that says, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, then she just gave up talking to her.
Stop.
Not talking to this woman.
Right. She's unreasonable.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not even clear that Naomi is pleased with this display of chesed. But Ruth knows what Naomi needs, and that she will not survive in that desert between Moab, Jordan, and Bethlehem, the mountains of Israel. She won't survive if she's on her own.
Yeah. Well, I think I just have one more question for you, if that's all right. When you read this story, why do you personally find it compelling? What about this story are you drawn to? And you can move beyond Ruth too here. I know that I've kind of brought you in for this particular part of the story, but you can look beyond it if you'd like.
Thank you. You used, at the beginning of our conversation, you used the word ordinary. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I find so compelling about the story. It's about very ordinary people. Even Boaz, who's a landowner, he's a landowner, but in a little tiny town. He's a small farmer. And two widow women, bottom of the social heap, so to speak.
Right.
All of these people dealing with tragic and yet very ordinary circumstances.
Right.
most people died young in the ancient world.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's interesting. God is really in the background of this book. There are very few, this is not like Genesis where or Exodus where God's hand is very much in evidence. Um, God does very little directly in
Mhm.
this book, breaks the famine, gives the pregnancy. That's it.
Right.
Everything else is what we see is how practitioners of Hesed, godly people, treat each other.
Right.
And what's striking is that all of them are in some way vulnerable, even Boaz.
Right.
And Boaz says to Ruth on the threshing floor, um, this act of chesed toward me and asking me, Boaz, to marry you, this is even greater than what you did for Naomi.
Wow.
Now, we don't know why Boaz receives this as an act of kindness. Evidently, he had everything he needed except, it seems, love.
Yeah.
So they're all vulnerable. They all yield to each other's wisdom at some point.
Yeah.
Naomi yields to Ruth. Ruth will later yield to Naomi. Boaz yields to Ruth. And yet Boaz will also protect Ruth. It's
Right.
that dynamic of people discerning what the other really needs, even in their own uh, vulnerability, and having the generosity to trust each other and give to each other. And out of that, a future unfolds that they could never imagine. As far as we know, everyone in the story dies in Bethlehem, 8 miles down the road from Jerusalem, never suspecting that a few generations, down the road, David will be sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. And it's this ordinariness that stands in such contrast to the book next door, the book of Judges.
Mm.
And the first phrase of the book of Ruth is in the days when the judges were judging Israel.
Yeah.
So it's reminding us of that book. And judges, we think of judges as people who sit on a bench in a courtroom.
Right.
Uh, the Hebrew word really means what we now call leaders,
Okay.
military leaders. Some of them did judge court cases, so to speak, at the city gate, not in the courtroom. But most of the so-called leaders, shoftim in the book of Judges, they're disasters.
Yeah.
They completely fail to demonstrate chesed, with the result that more Israelites die at their hands than the hostile enemies. Um, and so in contrast to that, we have this, might say, still small voice,
Mm.
the tiny book of Ruth about these ordinary people trying to make a life out of quite unpromising situations in a corner
Yeah.
that, as far as they know, no one will ever know about them.
Wow.
And that is a remarkable statement about what it is to practice chesed and open up the future. Because, of course, Ruth, the great grandmother of David, becomes the mother of the Messiah.
Right. Yeah. What a story. Well, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for taking some time and helping us catch the vision that's going on in this story and understand some of what was going on all that time ago and how it might lead us to practice Hesed in our own life.
My pleasure, and blessings on your study.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.